Arizona, summer of 1887, Cinder Wells Depot, high noon, red dust filling the air. Silas Cray held the papers up for the crowd to see, his voice flat and deliberate. No husband, no name, and no place to go. Marin stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on his hands, her fingers white-knuckled around the handle of her travel case inside it, the only evidence that could save her, and a dozen missing women. Then a stranger stepped out of the crowd, his voice quiet and unhurried. Come home. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he wanted. If you want to know where this story goes, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter. The freight wagon slowed for the water tank, and Marin jumped. She hit the gravel wrong, caught herself with both hands, and came up bleeding from the right palm. Her travel case swung hard against her hip. She pulled it close and kept moving. Two of Vane's men were already on the passenger platform. She had spotted them through a gap in the wagon's side slats. Gray coats, wide-brimmed hats. The particular way they stood still in a crowd while everyone else moved around them. She had maybe 4 minutes before they figured out she hadn't come through the main door. Cinder Wells smelled like coal smoke and hot iron, and the distant promise of rain that never quite arrived. The sky to the west had turned the color of a bruise. Dust devils skipped across the freight yard. People on the platform were glancing up at the clouds, deciding whether to hurry or wait. Marin chose the side entrance to the depot, the one marked for freight agents. Nobody stopped her. Inside, the air was close and smelled of tobacco and paper. The station clerk had his back half turned, sorting through a stack of receipts. The telegraph receiver on the far wall was clicking steadily, a routine schedule dispatch from the sound of it. Nothing urgent. She set her case on the counter. East, she said. Whatever leaves today. The clerk turned around, looked her over once, and reached for the fare book. Name? She slid the placement papers across. Alice Trent. My husband was expected at the Morrow Mine. The clerk opened the papers and went still. She watched his face. That particular stillness told her everything. Before he said a single word, he turned to the telegraph table and picked up a received message that was already waiting there. Folded once, he unfolded it slowly, which meant he had already read it and was reading it again to be certain. It was a wire this morning. He set the message on the counter between them. Alice Trent passed in April. Fever outside of Tucson. The receiver in the corner started clicking again. A different rhythm, this time shorter, deliberate. The kind of message you send when you don't want the main office to log it. Marin listened without moving her head. The door behind her opened. She knew who it was before she turned around. The footsteps were too deliberate, too certain. A man who already knew how this conversation was going to end. Silas Cray was short and broad across the shoulders, with a freight agent's badge pinned crooked on his coat. 2 armed men followed him in. Another one stayed by the door. Miss. He didn't look at her like she was a person. He looked at her like she was a package with the wrong label. Vane Continental has a warrant for your arrest. Murder of relay supervisor Edwin Cross and theft of company property. I don't know anyone by that name. You also don't appear to know your own name. He picked up the placement papers and held them up so the people gathering near the window could see. His voice rose just enough. No husband, no name, and no place to go. The clerk stepped back. The couple nearest the door moved aside. Not cruelly, just the way people move when they don't want to be involved in whatever comes next. Marin gripped the handle of her travel case. The cipher strip was inside the wooden handle, wrapped in a length of oilcloth. If they took the case, everything was gone. The receiver clicked again. She heard it this time clearly. The rhythm was Cray's private operator. She had transcribed his work for 3 months and knew his touch the way you know a person's handwriting. The message was short. 4 words. Bring the girl alive. I'll need to speak with a federal deputy, she said. Cray smiled. Nearest marshal's a day's ride. You'll be comfortable until he arrives. He nodded to the men behind her. She stays where she is. The voice came from near the freight window. Quiet, not loud enough to be theatrical about it. Just a statement of fact delivered by a man who saw no reason to raise his voice because he didn't expect to be argued with. Marin turned. He was standing about 8 feet away, near a stack of shipping crates. Tall and lean, with a gray hat and a plain dark vest. He had his hands loose at his sides, not reaching for anything, not posturing. He was watching Cray the way a man watches weather coming in. Patient, measuring. She had no idea who he was. Cray did, though. A small change moved across Cray's face, not fear exactly, but the recalculation you do when something unexpected enters the equation. Talbot, Cray said, this isn't your business. Federal deputy hears her account first. The man didn't raise his voice. That's the law. She's a fugitive with a warrant. She's a woman with disputed papers and no legal counsel. He looked at her then, not through her the way Cray did. Actually, at her, and she hasn't been charged before any court I've heard of. Cray's hand moved toward his coat. Touch that, the man said, and I'll have 3 things to report to Deputy Beck instead of 1. A silence held for a few seconds. Outside, the wind had picked up. Dust ticked against the window glass. Marin was watching the man's hands. He had noticed her looking at Cray's men even before they moved. He had tracked the positions of every armed person in the room without appearing to do it. That was not a skill you learned in a drawing room. He looked at her again. Come home, he said. 2 words. That was all. She searched his face for something she recognized: ownership, calculation, pity, the particular expression men wore when they decided a situation was theirs to manage. She didn't find any of it. Not going anywhere with a stranger, she said. Reed Talbot, I raise horses. My ranch is 4 miles outside of town. He said it, the way you'd answer a question someone actually asked. Deputy Beck will be here in 2 days. You stay until he hears your account, and after that, you do what you choose. And if I want to leave before Beck arrives, then you leave. She looked at Cray. His men had shifted slightly, angling to cut off the door. Whatever authority she had in this room was shrinking by the minute, and she knew it. She had not survived 3 weeks as Alice Trent by being sentimental about her options. She picked up her case. If your men follow us past the freight yard, she said to Cray, I will describe the message I just heard on your telegraph to every person in this building. Cray went still. The one your operator sent 5 minutes ago, she continued, the one with the routing mark you don't file with the main office. I know that mark. I know what account it belongs to. She watched him decide. She was telling the truth, and he could see that she was, which was the only thing that mattered. She walked to the door. Talbot fell into step beside her, without being asked, not ahead of her, and not crowding her, just there. Outside, the first breath of the storm came through the freight yard. Marin's coat snapped in the wind. Above the water tower, the sky had gone the color of iron. She didn't look back. Cray's men didn't follow past the gate, not immediately. Anyway. Talbot brought 2 horses around from the side of the livery. He handed her the reins of the quieter one without comment and swung up into his own saddle. He didn't offer to help her mount and didn't make a performance of not offering. They rode north out of Cinder Wells in silence into the rising wind. Marin kept her case across her lap. The cipher strip was still there. The shorthand notes were still sewn into the coat lining. She had given Cray false information about where she'd hidden them, told him she'd mailed a copy to a post office in El Paso, which was entirely invented. It would buy a few hours, maybe more, while Vane's people tried to verify it. She watched the road behind them until the town disappeared. Talbot didn't ask for her story, didn't ask what was in the case, didn't say anything at all for almost a mile. That itself told her something, though she hadn't decided yet what. The wind was solid and steady now. The lanterns along the ranch road ahead swayed on their posts. Lightning walked across the mountains to the south, silent at this distance, just a flicker behind the clouds. She would stay 2 days. She would speak to the deputy. She would keep her own counsel and make her own plan. That was all this was. She told herself that clearly, so she would remember it. That night, Marin lay awake in the room. He had given her door to the outside, key on the inside, listening to the desert settle into the dark. The storm had passed without breaking. The air smelled like heat and dust, and something faintly mineral from the hills. She was almost asleep when she heard it. A soft clicking, metallic, rhythmic. She sat up. It was coming through the window frame, through the wall itself, almost traveling through something outside. She pressed her fingers to the adobe and felt the faintest vibration. She knew that rhythm. She had spent 3 years learning to hear the difference between one hand and another on a key. She knew exactly how to count the pauses, how to read what lived in the spaces between the signals. She counted it twice, to be certain. Then she lay back down in the dark and stared at the ceiling. Someone outside in the night was spelling out a dead woman's name, Alicetrent, over and over, like a question or a warning or both. Marin was dressed and out the door before the sky turned gray. She followed the sound along the fence line, moving quiet in the pre-dawn dark, her boots finding the hard pan by feel. The clicking was gone now, stopped sometime before 3, while she was still deciding whether to get up. But the direction had been clear, west fence, maybe 40 yards out. She found it on the third post from the corner. A small copper contact, no bigger than a thumbscrew, clamped to the fence wire with a piece of electrical tape that was still slightly warm from recent handling. Whoever had placed it hadn't been gone long. She unpinched it carefully and held it in her palm. Someone had turned Reed Talbot's fence into a telegraph line. She was still standing there when she heard boots on the gravel behind her. Found something. Reed stopped a few feet away, looked at the contact in her hand, and said nothing for a moment. Then he walked the fence line in both directions for about 100 yards each way, moving with a lantern held low. He came back empty-handed. "Whoever it was is gone," he said. They were close. The signal was clear. She handed him the contact. "They didn't need a long wire, just long enough to hear me, if I'd answered, and if you had. They'd know the cipher strip is still with me." Reed turned the contact over once and put it in his vest pocket. His face didn't change much, but he looked out at the low ridgeline to the west a beat longer than necessary. They went back inside without discussing it further. Breakfast was already on the stove. When they reached the kitchen, a woman with iron-gray hair and deliberate hands was turning cornbread in a cast-iron pan without looking at it, the way you do things you've done 10,000 times. "Inez Ortega," Reed said. "She runs the ranch." Inez looked at Marin the way an experienced person looks at a situation, gathering information before forming an opinion. "You eat," she said. It was an instruction, not an invitation. Marin sat down. "I want to work," she said, when Reed poured coffee and settled across from her. "Whatever needs doing. I don't stay anywhere without contributing. You have an injured ankle and a cut hand. I've worked with worse." Reed set down his cup. "It's not a debt, Miss Holt. Whatever you do here isn't payment for the room." "I didn't say it was." She kept her voice level. "I said it's what I do." He considered that. "Fine. Talk to Inez." They worked out the terms the way two careful people negotiate a temporary truce, measured, specific, nothing assumed. 3 days until Deputy Beck arrived. Marin had a room with a working exterior lock, and the key stayed with her. She could move freely around the ranch. She wasn't expected to explain herself to the hands, and Reed wouldn't tell them more than they needed to know. "The workshop," she said. "The one by the south barn. Is it in use?" He paused. "Not regularly." "I'd like to see it." Another pause, longer. After the horses, she spent the morning with Inez, learning where things were kept and helping sort the supply inventory. Inez worked without unnecessary conversation, which Marin appreciated. But she watched. Marin noticed that the older woman cataloging her, testing her patience and her usefulness simultaneously. Around mid-morning, a boy of about 16 appeared in the barn doorway, carrying a coil of wire over one shoulder and a canvas tool bag over the other. He had an open, alert face and the perpetually squinting expression of someone who spent a lot of time looking at things far away. "Tobin Lane," Inez said. without looking up. He knows the towers better than anyone, including Reed. Tobin set down his tools and gave Marin a straightforward look. You're the woman from town. I am. Cray's been asking questions at the South Trailhead. One of the hands saw his men on the ridge this morning. He said it factually, not to frighten her. She added it to the count of things she already knew. He showed her the lantern tower patterns that afternoon, 3 towers spaced across the property, each built from timber and stone on high ground, each with a pulley system for raising signals. The patterns were Elias Talbot's original design, 2 short pulls for weather warning, 1 long for flood, 3 for danger, combinations for direction. Your father built these, Marin asked Reed, when he appeared at the base of the northern tower. He did. Reed looked up at the lamp housing without expression. Before the freight work, she waited to see if he'd say more. He didn't. A horse returned to the yard at midday without a rider. One of the hands caught it by the halter near the water trough, a paint mare, sweating hard, eyes white-rimmed. Around the saddle horn, someone had looped a piece of vein continental rope in a particular pattern. Not tangled. Arranged. Reed stood looking at it for a long moment. Martinez went to check the south fence, one of the hands said. Left 2 hours ago. Take 2 men and find him. Reed's voice was quiet. Don't use the main road. Martinez was found on foot a mile out, unhurt, with a headache and a story about his horse shying at something in the brush. He hadn't seen anyone. The rope around the saddle horn might have snagged on anything. Marin tucked that alongside the fence contact and the ridge watchers and the rope arrangement, and she felt the shape of it clearly. Vane was not going to wait long. She moved the cipher strip that evening, unwrapping it from the travel case handle and working it into a seam inside her boot heel where the leather was thickest. Her hands knew the operation. Without much thinking, she had practiced it in the dark on 3 different occasions since leaving the relay office. The workshop was locked. Reed brought the key himself. Inside, an old telegraph receiver on the workbench, a manual sender, a glass case of insulators, coils of wire on wooden spools, a box of tools, both electrical and mechanical, and dust everywhere, except around the receiver, where the surface had been recently disturbed. Not cleaned, disturbed. A ring in the dust where something cylindrical had sat and been removed. Marin ran her finger along the edge. When did you last come in here? She asked. Reed stood in the doorway. 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. She pointed to the ring in the dust without touching it again. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at the window latch. From the outside, it would have taken someone with a thin blade and some patience. A minute, maybe less. Someone's been in here, she said. He walked in and checked the glass case, the toolbox, the wire spools. Everything appeared to be there. Nothing obvious was missing. But she watched his face as he moved around the room and saw when something changed in it, not alarm, more like a door closing quietly somewhere behind his eyes. He stopped in front of a shelf above the workbench. The shelf held one item, a blue glass telegraph insulator, thick-walled and clouded with age, sitting in a small wooden cradle. The kind railroads used to protect wire connections in weather. She had seen hundreds of them. They were practical objects, nothing more. This one had been moved. Fractionally, the cradle sat at a slight angle to the dust outline beneath it. Reed picked it up and turned it over, checking the metal hardware at its base. He put it back at the correct angle with a deliberateness that told her it mattered to him. That was my father's, he said. She didn't ask more than that. Not yet. She spent an hour examining the telegraph equipment while Reed watched from the doorway, not interfering and not helping. The receiver was in reasonable condition. The main contact had a break in it, a simple enough repair. She asked for a specific gauge of wire, and Tobin appeared with it inside 5 minutes, which confirmed her suspicion that the boy had been stationed nearby the whole time. I could repair this, she said, and the fence wire on the west side would carry a signal if we connected it through a relay here. Reed was quiet. I'm not asking to run your network, she said. I'm saying that if Vane's operator is using your fence, we could hear what they're transmitting. We'd know before they moved. And if they're listening back, then we don't transmit anything we don't mean for them to hear. He looked at the receiver, then at her. You said you'd trained operators. It was the first time he'd made it a statement, instead of letting it hang as a question. I did. Where? She met his eyes. The same company that issued my employment papers. The same company that sent Cray to collect me yesterday. He understood what she was telling him, not just the fact, but what it cost her to say it plainly. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. All right, he said. Do what you need to do in here. She had the contact repaired before dark. She connected one test wire to the fence relay without activating the main circuit, enough to listen, not enough to announce herself. Reed brought a lantern and set it on the workbench without being asked. They stayed there in the quiet for a while, both of them listening. Then she heard it faint, distant, traveling through the single wire she'd laid. A testing pulse. Someone checking whether the line was live. She put 2 fingers on the bench and tapped back. Nothing intelligible. Just static interference, the kind of accidental contact that happens with an improperly grounded wire. Enough to make a careful operator think the line was dead. The pulse came once more and stopped. Reed had been watching her hands. You understood that, he said. I always understand it. She pulled the relay contact. That was one of Vane's outstation operators. They're less than a mile away. Reed looked at the darkened window. The old line, she said. The one from here to the relay station in the mountains. Was it ever connected to the main Vane network? She watched him make a decision. Once, he said. A long time ago. And he reached past her, opened the glass case, and took out the blue insulator again. He turned it upside down. At the base of the metal fitting, scratched into the lead collar with something sharp, was a small number. A routing mark, the kind freight companies use to identify private relay accounts. Marin looked at it. She looked at it for a long time, because she had seen that number before. Not somewhere general, not somewhere vague. She had seen it 3 weeks ago, transcribed by her own hand, in the set of messages she had sewn into the lining of her coat. She almost said so. She almost told him everything, the cipher strip, the old order she hadn't been able to fully decode, all of it. She stopped herself, not because she didn't trust him. She hadn't decided that yet. She stopped because she had learned through hard experience that there was a specific moment when you gave away what you were carrying, and if you chose wrong, you didn't get a second chance. That's an interesting mark, she said carefully. Reed put the insulator back. My father scratched it there, he said. The night before Samuel died. Marin kept her hands still. Before she could find a way to answer, the receiver on the bench clicked to life. She moved to it without thinking, automatic as breathing. She counted the pulses, counted them again. She sat back. What does it say? Reed asked. She turned the message over once in her mind before she answered, checking it, making sure she had it right. Bring the girl to Black Mesa, she said. She must arrive alive. The fire started just after noon. Marin was in the workshop, adjusting the relay contact, when she smelled the smoke thin at first, then thick and sharp, the kind that comes from dry grass catching fast. She stepped outside and saw it. A line of orange crawling along the lower fence, moving northeast toward the horse corrals. The wind was pushing it. She went to the bell cord by the barn door and pulled it 3 times, the way Tobin had shown her, which meant emergency. Then she climbed the north fence rail to see farther. The fire was moving fast. The grass between the lower pasture and the corrals had been cured dry by weeks without rain. All it needed was one strike. And the storm 2 nights back had given it plenty of those. Reed was already on horseback at the far end of the lower pasture. She could see him distant through the smoke, turning the herd, pushing them north and away from the fire's path. The horses were wild with it, that particular panic, that nothing calms except distance. He had his hands full. Inez appeared at Marin's shoulder. Water wagons out with Martinez, won't be back for an hour. The lantern on the south tower. Marin was already moving. Who's in range? Segundo Ruiz. He's at the far water tank with 2 hands. If we can signal him, he can bring horses and tools to cut a fire break at the lower fence corner. Inez gave her a look not skeptical, more measuring. The pulley on the south tower hasn't worked right since spring. The wheel sticks. Show me. The south tower was a 60-foot timber frame with a lantern housing at the top and a system of rope and iron pulleys running down to a crank handle at the base. Tobin had walked her through it the day before. The principle was simple. Pull the rope in patterns. The lantern swings. Someone with good eyes and the right knowledge reads the signal. The pulley wheel stuck at the third pull every time. The rope frayed at a weak point just above the lower block. Marin looked at the setup for about 30 seconds. She went back to the workshop. She had already run the fence wire relay to the workshop bench. The connection wasn't long, barely 400 yards. But Tobin had mentioned yesterday that Ruiz's station had a signal box connected to the same old line, left over from Elias Talbot's original network. She checked the wire, checked the contact, and used the key. 3 short. Pause. Too long. That was the flood warning pattern Tobin had shown her, the one Ruiz would know by instinct. Then she added something after it. 1 short, 1 long, 1 short, which in standard code meant R, then U. She tapped his initials, paused, and tapped the ranch code Tobin had used for the south fence. 40 seconds passed. 2 long pulses came back through the wire. Understood. Marin exhaled. She went back outside and found Tobin at the base of the south tower, trying to force the stuck pulley by hand. She pulled him back from it. How far can Ruiz see from the tank? Clear line to the south ridge, but not the corral. He doesn't need to see the corral. He needs to see the fire line. She tapped his arm. Go up when I tell you. Raise the lantern twice and hold it. The pulley, I fixed the contact issue. Just manage the rope. Tobin looked at her, looked at the tower, and went up. Marin ran the remaining wire segment along the fence post and grounded it with a stake the way the old system was designed. Then she called up to Tobin. The lantern rose. Held. Ruiz would see the signal now, combined with the wire message, and know exactly where to bring his crew. Reed came back from the far pasture at a canter, shirt dark with smoke and dust, arriving at the corral fence just as the fire reached the lower clearing and stopped. A gap where Martinez had pulled out a section of dry brush the week before to check the fence posts. The fire had nothing left to eat. It burned along the edges of the gap, found no fuel, and began dying from its own lack. 20 minutes later, Ruiz and his men arrived and finished it with wet feed sacks. Reed dismounted and stood at the edge of the burned grass. Marin came to stand near the fence. Her right ankle was aching. She had climbed the base rungs of the south tower to check Tobin's grip on the rope and landed wrong coming back down. You sent the signal through the wire, Reed said. It wasn't a question. The pulley was stuck. I used the contact I repaired last night. He was quiet for a moment. You said you'd trained operators. I've said that twice now. I know. I'm asking differently. He turned to look at her directly. Where did you actually learn this? She met his eyes. From an old man named Denton Farr, who ran the station at Seco Crossing. I was 17. He had no assistant, and I had no other prospects, so we solved each other's problems. She paused. I learned his entire circuit in 4 months. Vane's Placement Bureau hired me 3 years later because I could identify individual operators by their cadence. They thought it was useful, and then you became useful in a way they didn't intend. Something like that. He nodded once. The afternoon cooled as the burn smell cleared. Reed stayed near the south pasture while Inez organized the remaining hands to check the fence line. Tobin came down from the tower, found Marin at the fence, and told her with genuine admiration that he'd never seen anyone run 2 signal methods at the same time. It's just math, she said. Timing. You count the gaps. Could I learn it? The wire part, I mean. I know the towers. If you have patience for the code, yes. He grinned. I've got the patterns for every ranch in a 40-mile basin in my head. I think I can manage a code. She looked at him. She believed it. Reed came back at dusk and found her on the workshop step, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee Inez had brought, watching the last of the light leave the ridgeline to the west. He sat down on the fence rail nearby and took off his hat. He held it for a moment, turning the brim in his hands. Then he reached into the workshop and lifted the blue glass insulator from its shelf. He carried it outside and held it up. So what remained of the sunset came through it, and the glass threw a wash of pale blue across his hands, his shirt, the fence post behind him. "Samuel," he said. The convoy came through Black Mesa Canyon after receiving the safe signal. The signal was wrong. Elias, my father, he'd reported that the equipment on the North Tower had been altered. Nobody recorded the complaint. Marin listened. The inquiry lasted 4 days. Vane brought 3 men who said they'd seen my father hang a false signal. I was there. He set the insulator on the fence post. They asked me to stand and confirm or deny what my father had reported. I stood up, and then I sat back down. He said the last part without drama, just a flat accounting. "You froze," Marin said. I froze. He looked at the glass. Elias didn't recover from it. He died 8 years later with the verdict still on his name. She looked at the routing mark scratched into the base of the insulator, which she had been thinking about all day, which she had been thinking about since the moment she first saw it. She made a decision. She went back inside, took off her coat, and used the small blade from the tool bench to open the she had sewn along the inside lining. She removed a folded paper, thin, covered in her own shorthand, the symbols tight and small. She came back out and held it in the remaining light. "This number on your insulator," she said. "It's a routing mark from Vane's private telegraph account. The one that doesn't get filed with the standard office records." She showed him the shorthand page. I transcribed 6 messages that came through that account. 2 of them mention a signal order at a mountain relay station. I couldn't decode the final destination sequence without the master ledger. She paused. That ledger would be at the station itself. Reed looked at the page for a long time without touching it. "Black Mesa," he said. "I think so, yes." He reached into his vest and produced something she hadn't seen before, a piece of paper, burned at 2 edges, folded along a crack that had been carefully preserved for a long time. He unfolded it on the fence post beside the insulator. It was a telegram. Old, the paper had gone amber with age. The text was partially legible, but the routing sequence at the top was complete. It matched the number on the insulator. It matched the number in her shorthand. She read the fragment of the body text that remained. "Confirm signal change at north position before convoy departure." Authorization confirmed by the authorization line was burned away. "I found this in the ash after they cleared the canyon," Reed said. "I've had it 18 years, and I've never been able to make the routing numbers mean anything." She thought about telling him she could make them mean something now. She thought about telling him about the cipher strip in her boot heel. She almost did. Then, the receiver inside the workshop clicked. Both of them heard it. She went in, sat at the bench, and listened. Reed came to stand in the doorway behind her. The message was short. She counted it twice, checked it against the cipher she carried in her memory. When she turned around, his face told her he already knew. It wasn't good. "Bring the girl to Black Mesa," she said. "She must arrive alive." Reed looked at her steadily. "Same message as last night," he said. "Different operator." She set her hands flat on the bench. "This one is closer, and this one is using the routing mark from your father's insulator." Outside, the last light was gone. One of the signal lanterns on the west tower swayed in the wind. Marin looked at it through the workshop window and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, yet that would make the shape of this any smaller. The storm came in fast from the south, the way desert storms do, no gradual buildup, just a wall of purple cloud that swallowed the mountains and kept coming. Deputy Beck arrived ahead of it. By 20 minutes, his horse lathered and his hat dark with dust. He tied up at the rail without ceremony and came through the courtyard gate carrying a leather satchel and a look that told Marin the news inside it was not good. Reed met him on the step. Marin stayed near the workshop door. Beck opened the satchel on the kitchen table. He produced a wanted, circular, printed, not handwritten, which meant it had gone through a proper office. The illustration was rough, but recognizable enough. Alice Trent, Beck read aloud, wanted for the murder of relay supervisor Edwin Cross and theft of company property. Vane Continental Freight. Reward of $300. He set it down. Vane filed it with the territorial office 4 days ago. I'm required to tell you it exists. And? Reed said. And I'm also required to tell you that a $300 reward on a woman, without a verified identity, is going to bring every bounty hunter in the basin through Cinder Wells inside a week. Marin came to the table. She looked at the circular for a moment, then looked at Beck. Alice Trent died in April, she said. Fever outside Tucson. The station clerk in Cinder Wells had the wire confirming it. I am not Alice Trent, then. Who are you? Marin Holt. I worked as a telegraph operator for Vane's Placement Bureau at the Seco Crossing Relay Station. Edwin Cross was my supervising operator. When I discovered what the placement service was actually doing to the women it transported, I tried to leave with evidence. Cross attempted to stop me. During the struggle, an oil lamp was knocked from its stand. The relay office caught fire. She stopped. Cross was inside when it went up. I wasn't. Beck studied her. You're saying it was an accident. I'm saying I didn't set the fire and I didn't kill him. What I am saying is that I was standing in the building when he died, and I ran, which I understand looks exactly as bad as Vane says it does. Beck sat down. He rubbed the side of his jaw with his thumb. The Placement Bureau. What exactly are you claiming it was doing? Transporting women to isolated freight and mining camps under fraudulent employment contracts, manipulating their wages and debts so they couldn't leave, controlling their communication by controlling the telegraph lines in and out of the camps. She paused. I have documentation. I'd like to see it. I'd like to know I can trust a federal deputy before I show it to anyone. Beck looked at Reed. Reed looked at the window, where the first rain was beginning to hit the glass in hard horizontal lines. She has reason to be careful, Reed said. I'd hear her out. Beck settled back in his chair. All right, talk. Marin reached into her coat and removed the folded shorthand pages, the ones she had shown Reed the previous evening. She spread 3 of them on the table. These are transcriptions I made from Vane's private telegraph account. The routing mark in the upper corner is a non-filed account, meaning these messages don't appear in any official record. They reference placement numbers assigned to specific women, coordinates for freight stops in remote areas, and debt calculations that bear no relation to any legitimate employment wage. Beck bent over the pages. He studied them for a long time. I can't read shorthand, he said. I know I'm the only one who can read these particular pages, which is part of why I'm still alive, she said it plainly. If Vane believed anyone else could interpret this documentation, I'd already be dead instead of wanted. Beck looked up at her. I won't arrest you tonight, he said. I don't have enough to counter the warrant without more evidence. But I need you to understand that I may not be able to hold that position if territorial pressure comes from above my authority. How long? Reed asked. A week, maybe less. Lightning turned the kitchen window white for a split second. The thunder came rolling in 3 beats later. Marin looked at Reed. He looked back at her, and she saw in his face that he had been holding something back since the previous night, since she'd shown him the shorthand pages, and he'd produced the burned telegram in return. She had felt it, the weight of information he was still carrying. You've been keeping something from me, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact, delivered quietly the way she delivered most things. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his vest and set the burned telegram on the table between them. I showed you this last night, he said, but I didn't tell you where it came from. He told her then the full account. The convoy, Samuel's death, the inquiry, the 4 days during which Vane's men produced witnesses and documentation, and Reed had sat in a wooden chair and failed to speak when asked directly about his father's warning reports. He told it without embellishment and without asking for anything in response. When he finished, Marin was looking at the telegram. "This routing sequence," she said, "I can partially decode it, but without the master ledger for this account, I can only recover part of the message." Where would the ledger be? At the relay station, where the account was originally filed. She looked at him. Black Mesa. Beck picked up the telegram carefully. He studied the routing numbers, though she could see he couldn't interpret them any more than he could read her shorthand. If there is a ledger at Black Mesa that connects this telegram to Vane, then we'd have documentation of what he ordered 18 years ago, Marin said, connected by the same routing account to what he's doing now. Reed stared at the table for a moment. "I should have spoken during that inquiry." I stood up, and then I sat back down. I told myself it was because I wasn't certain enough. But I was certain. I was just afraid of what Vane's people would do if I contradicted them in public. "You were 19, Beck said. Samuel was 12. Reed looked at the burned telegram. "Age doesn't fix what I didn't do." Marin thought about telling him that guilt carried too long starts to feel like identity, and that they were different things. She decided it wasn't the right moment. "I'm going to Black Mesa," she said instead, "with or without permission. The evidence there will support the documentation I already have. We can stop the warrant, establish the placement network's current operations," and she stopped. The courtyard gate opened. A figure came through it in the rain, moving wrong. One shoulder dropped, one hand pressed to her ribs. Marin was at the door before Reed reached it. The woman was maybe 30. She had dark hair plastered to her face and a gash along her forearm that had stopped bleeding only because the rain had thinned it to nothing. She looked up when the door opened, and for a second, her expression was purely animal fear, deciding whether to run or collapse. Then she looked at Marin, and something in her face gave way. "June Halley," she said. Her voice was barely there. I need Reed Talbot," I was told he. "Come inside," Marin said. Inez had her seated, and her arm wrapped inside 5 minutes. Beck sat at the far end of the table, giving her space, which Marin noted and appreciated. Reed brought coffee and stood near the wall. June had been at Copper Hollow Camp for 2 years. She'd arrived through the placement bureau, a seamstress position, legitimate wages, a contract that looked reasonable on paper. Within 3 months, the contract had accrued fees she didn't remember agreeing to. Transportation costs, supply debts, a fine for a broken needle she didn't remember breaking. The wages were applied against the debt before she ever touched them. "There are women at Black Mesa now," June said. 7 of them, maybe more. There was talk about a special train moving them out before an inspection. But moving them where, they wouldn't say. Beck had gone very still. "A federal inspection?" he said. Someone at the main office was asking questions about the placement records. That's what Silas Cray told the camp manager. He said everything needed to move before the inspector arrived. Marin looked at Reed. "The train schedule," she said. "The one in the messages I transcribed, it's not just about women. It's about company records. He's going to destroy both at once." "How?" Beck asked. "There's a trestle at a place called Widow's Cut. The flood channel underneath it runs dry most of the year, but in monsoon season," she stopped because June had reached into her coat pocket and set something on the table. A small silver pocket watch, scratched and dented, with initials engraved on the case. "ST." Reed crossed the room in 3 steps. He picked it up, turned it over. His face went absolutely still. "Where did you get this?" His voice was quiet, controlled. "Storage chest at Copper Hollow," June said. There was a box of items, things that had been collected, they said, from a freight accident. Salvage. She looked at the watch. "The initials meant nothing to me, but there was a woman at the camp who'd been there longer than anyone," she said. "The box came from Black Mesa Canyon. 18 years ago." Reed set the watch on the table. Marin understood immediately what it meant. If Samuel Talbot's watch was in a Vane Company storage chest collected from the Black Mesa accident site, someone connected to Vane had been there immediately after, not as a rescue party, as a cleanup. He knew what the signal order would cause, Marin said. He had people at the site before the rescue teams arrived. Reed looked at her, then at the burned telegram, then at the insulator on the workshop shelf, visible through the open door. "We're going to Black Mesa," he said. It wasn't a question this time. Beck started to object proper procedure. Chain of evidence, federal jurisdiction. Reed let him finish, then looked at him steadily. "The women on that train have placement numbers," Reed said. "If we wait for proper procedure, the train runs first." Beck rubbed his face with both hands. "I can't officially sanction this. I'm not asking you to." Reed looked at Marin. "We leave before dawn." Beck stayed. He said he'd hold his position here and keep watch, which was the most useful thing available to him at that moment, and he seemed to know it. Marin went to the barn to check on the horses for morning. She took the lantern from the hook inside the door and moved down the stalls, checking the water and the feed. The rain was loud on the barn roof. The horses were quiet, which was a relief after the fire animals that have been frightened once stay wary for days. She got to the last stall and lifted the lantern. One of Vane's men was hanging unconscious from the loft rope, wrists bound above his head. Not dead, she could see his chest moving. His boots were several inches off the ground. Below him, on the saddle draped over the stall rail, someone had carved into the leather with a sharp blade. The letters were clear, deliberate, and recent. She could smell the fresh-cut leather. "One of you has already betrayed the others." They left at 4 in the morning. Marin, Reed, June, and Tobin, who had appeared at the barn door with his canvas tool bag and a look that dared anyone to tell him to stay behind. Reed had looked at him for a long second and said nothing, which Tobin correctly interpreted as permission. Inez stood in the courtyard with a lantern as they rode out. She said nothing either. She didn't have to. Reed chose the dry canyon route longer, harder footing in the dark, but it kept them off the main road and away from the ridge where Vane's watchers had been positioned. Marin rode second in the line, the cipher strip in her boot heel, and the shorthand pages in her coat lining, and she counted the hoofbeats in even sets of 4, the way she counted code when she needed to stay calm. The trouble started an hour in. They heard it before they saw it. The ground-shaking rumble that at first sounds like thunder, but has too much weight to it, too much direction. Reed held up his hand, and they stopped. Then the first cattle came around the bend. Loose, panicked, moving fast. A dozen, then 2 dozen, then more than Marin could count, pouring into the canyon mouth from a side ravine on the right. Behind them, barely visible in the first gray of pre-dawn, 2 riders driving them hard. Vane's men. Reed wheeled his horse and shouted something she couldn't hear over the noise. The herd split around them for a moment, and then the canyon walls funneled everything together, and there was no splitting. There was just the herd and the narrow walls and the rising sound of the flood channel somewhere below. Reed's horse went sideways on the loose rock. She saw him go, not a clean fall. His boot caught for a second and then released, and he hit the canyon floor on his right shoulder. He came up immediately, which told her he was conscious and functional, but he stayed low and held his arm close, which told her the shoulder wasn't right. The cattle passed. The canyon went quiet, except for the distant sound of water, not rain, but the upstream runoff that had been collecting for days in the higher elevations and was now finding its way down. Marin dismounted and went to Reed. "I can ride," he said before she asked. "I know." She looked at the shoulder. The joint was high, not dislocated, but badly wrenched. "Can you grip the reins?" A pause. Enough. Tobin had climbed a boulder at the canyon wall and was looking ahead. "The wash is coming up. Maybe 20 minutes before it fills." Marin looked at the canyon walls, then up. The old telegraph line had been strung along maintenance ledges cut into the rock face. She could see the ceramic posts where the insulators had once been mounted. About 15 feet up, running along a ledge, Wide enough for a careful person on foot. We leave the horses here, she said. There's a ledge. Reed looked up at it, back at her. That's 15 feet of loose rock face. It's a maintained access ledge. The maintenance crews had to reach the insulators for repairs. It'll hold. She looked at June. Can you climb? June looked at the ledge, at the rising sound in the wash, and nodded once. Tobin went first because he was the lightest and youngest, and he was already moving before anyone suggested it. He went up the rock face with his tool bag over his shoulder, like he'd done it regularly, which he possibly had. Marin followed, testing each handhold, keeping her weight close to the wall. June came after, slower but steady. Reed went last, one-handed and without complaint. The ledge was about 3 feet wide and ran along the canyon wall for 200 yards before connecting to a switchback trail that climbed to the upper rim. They walked it single file, the flood churning through the wash, below them, the early morning light beginning to separate the shadows. Nobody said anything for a while. At the top of the rim, they found 2 of the horses had followed them around by instinct to a natural trail Marin hadn't known existed. Reed's horse was one of them. Marin's was the other. Your father built good, Tobin said, looking back at the ledge. Reed looked at it, too. He did. They reached Black Mesa Relay Station mid-morning. It was a stone building on a flat shelf of rock built to last, the way military and early railroad structures were built, with walls 2 feet thick and a roof of flat stone slabs. The windows were shuttered with iron. The door had been locked, but the lock was old, and Reed had the key from Elias's belongings. Inside, a thick layer of dust, 2 telegraph benches, a collapsed chair, filing cabinets along the south wall, several standing open and emptied long ago, and a large iron stove in the corner that served both as heat and, Marin noticed immediately, as a wall, because the stove wasn't flush against the wall. There was a gap behind it, 6 inches of deliberate space, which was not how you installed a stove in a cold weather station. She looked at Reed. He looked at the stove. They moved it together. His bad shoulder meant she took most of the weight, Tobin taking the other side. Behind it, a section of floor planking that had been cut and reset, the seam visible only because Marin was looking for exactly this kind of thing. Below the planking, a tin box. Inside the tin box, a ledger. The ledger was dense, every page covered in columns of numbers, dates, routing marks, and abbreviated location codes. Marin sat on the floor of Black Mesa Relay Station with the cipher strip from her boot heel and went through it page by page while the others stood around her, and the morning light came through the high shuttered windows in strips. It took 40 minutes. She found the placement routes, first women's names, reduced to numbers, destinations listed by freight code, wage calculations that showed zeroing out of any positive balance within 60 days of arrival through manufactured charges. It matched her shorthand transcriptions. Exactly. It was corroboration. It was provable. She found the current schedule on the last 2 pages. A special train. Routing designation, VCF, Special 9. Passenger manifest listed by placement number, not names 12 numbers in total. Departure from the Copper Hollow siding in 4 days. Destination listed as W Cut Transfer Point, Widow's Cut. She turned one more page, which she almost didn't look at, because it was tucked inside the back cover like a loose insert rather than bound into the ledger. It was an order form. Old the paper had aged the same amber color as Reed's burned telegram. The routing mark at the top matched the insulator, matched the telegram fragment, matched her shorthand. The order was complete. It directed the night signalman at the north tower of Black Mesa Relay Station to display a false safe signal at a specific time on a specific date, 18 years past, confirming clear passage through the canyon below. At the bottom, the authorization line was intact. Authorized D. Vane, VCF main operations. Marin looked up at Reed. He had been reading over her shoulder for the last several minutes. She knew by his breathing it had changed, become more deliberate. The way breathing does when you're holding something very still inside yourself. Your father sent 3 warnings, she said. According to this ledger, they were received and logged by Vane's main office. They were never forwarded to the inquiry. Reed crouched down and looked at the authorization line for a long time without touching the page. He suppressed them, Reed said. Everyone. And then he put men at the inquiry to contradict what my father said. Yes. Reed stood up slowly. He walked to the far wall and stood there with his back to the room. For a moment, his good hand resting against the stone. Tobin looked at June. June looked at Marin. Marin gave them both a slight shake of her head and waited. When Reed turned back around, his face was composed. Not blank, there was something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before, a specific quality of anger that had been waiting 18 years for somewhere exact to land. The train schedule, he said. 4 days. Cora's placement number is on the manifest, Marin said. I checked twice. Reed absorbed that. We take the ledger and the order directly to Beck, he said. He takes it to the territorial inspector. The inspector won't act in 4 days, Marin said. Not on documentation he hasn't verified. Federal process takes time we don't have. So what are you saying? I'm saying we need to stop that train ourselves. And the ledger is what we use to prove why afterward. She paused. Cora and 11 other women are on that manifest. The trestle at Widow's Cut runs over a flood channel that's been rising all week. If Vane puts a train on that trestle during peak flood, it doesn't come back, Reed said. No. He was quiet for a moment. You chose to take the schedule rather than just the evidence for your own warrant. The warrant is a document, Marin said. Cora is a person. Something moved across his face. He looked at her with a directness that he didn't always allow himself, and she looked back at him without deflecting it. All right, he said. We take both. The smell hit them before the sound did a low chemical sweetness underneath the dry grass smoke, the kind that comes from burning brush that's been encouraged rather than accidentally lit. Tobin was at the door first. He cracked it open, and a line of smoke came under the gap. They set the brush, he said. The dry scrub below the station shelf was burning in a wide arc. Deliberate placement, 3 separate start points visible, connected by a wind-driven line. It would reach the station door inside 20 minutes. Marin put the ledger inside her coat against the shorthand pages. The cipher strip went back in her boot. She went to the telegraph bench on instinct, checking the connections, checking whether the old line still had any function. The line was dead, had been for years, but the signal lantern on the northern tower was still connected to its pulley system. She looked at it through the high-shuttered window. Then it moved. The lantern rose and fell in a deliberate sequence, not random, not wind-driven. A precise pattern, 3 short and 1 long, repeated twice. She had learned enough of Elias Talbot's tower code in the past 3 days to understand it. She turned to Reed. That signal, she said. Is that a warning pattern? Reed looked at the lantern. His expression shifted. That's not a warning, he said. That's a routing order. He looked at her. That's Vane telling someone to move. She counted the pattern again, checked it against the ledger code she had just spent 40 minutes memorizing. Her mouth went dry. It's not just a routing order, she said. It's the transit signal for VCF Special 9. She looked at him. He moved the schedule up. The train isn't leaving in 4 days. Reed stared at her. It's leaving tonight, she said. They came back down the mountain through smoke and thin light, Marin with the ledger pressed against her ribs and the cipher strip still in her boot, and arrived at Lantern Rock to find 3 horses dead in the South Corral. Not from the fire, from something in the water. Reed knelt beside the nearest one, a gray gelding he'd raised from a foal, and pressed his hand to its neck. He stayed there for a moment without speaking. Then he stood and walked to the main cistern and looked in. The surface had the dull, oily quality of water that had been tampered with. Lamp oil, from the smell of it. Introduced in sufficient quantity to make the water undrinkable, but not enough to be obvious at a glance. A deliberate calculation. Inez was already there. She had a strip of cloth over her nose and mouth and a bucket she'd pulled back from the trough. Martinez found it an hour ago. We've pulled all the animals off the main supply. Spring water, only until we can flush and test the cistern. How many sick? Reed asked. 3 dead, 2 more showing signs. The rest we caught in time. She looked at Reed steadily. The remount inspector was here this morning. He left a written notice. She produced it from her apron pocket. Reed read it without visible expression and handed it to Marin. The federal horse contract was suspended, pending investigation of the ranch's suitability as a military supplier. The language was formal and vague. The timing was not vague at all. Cray's been in town, Inez said, telling people the sick horses are because you've been harboring a woman who poisons livestock. Reed looked at Marin. I need to see Beck, he said. Beck rode out at dawn, Inez said. Left a message saying he'd be back by nightfall. Something about verifying a freight manifest at the Copper Hollow Junction. Reed set the suspension notice on the fence rail. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked away from it, which was more telling than anything he might have said. Marin went to the bunkhouse and asked to speak with the hands. There were 7 of them: Martinez, 2 brothers named Pell, a man called Shorty, who had worked the property since Elias's time, and 3 younger men hired in the spring. She stood in the doorway and told them plainly that she had not poisoned anything on this property, and that she understood if they had reasons to doubt that. Shorty said he'd been watching the south fence the past 2 nights, and he hadn't seen any woman near the water supply. He said it the way an old man states, something he is personally prepared to defend. The Pell brothers exchanged a look and said nothing, which Marin counted as neutral rather than hostile. She went back to the main house and found an envelope on the kitchen table, sealed with a plain wax stamp, addressed in a careful hand to Marin Holt or Alice Trent, as preferred. She broke the seal inside. A travel document. A letter of safe passage issued by Vane Continental Freight, signed by Darius Vane himself. It authorized unrestricted transportation east for 1 passenger, traveling under the name Marin Holt, her real name, correctly spelled, with details about her mother and her early employment history that she had never written down for any employer. Beside the travel document, a bank draft, enough money to start over cleanly almost anywhere, and beneath those, a single typed page. Vane's terms were simple. She would surrender the cipher strip and any transcribed documentation. She would make a signed statement that Reed Talbot had taken her from Cinder Wells against her will and held her at Lantern Rock under duress. She would leave the territory within 48 hours. In exchange, legitimate identity, passage east, and no further charges. She read the page twice. Then she set it on the table and went to find Reed. He was in the barn, checking the remaining horses. She set the travel document and the bank draft on the saddle rack in front of him and watched him read them. He read the terms page last. He was quiet for a long moment. You should take it, he said. Marin stared at him. It gives you your name legally. Money, transportation. Everything you came here without. He set the page down and didn't look at her. You'd be safe. It asks me to accuse you of kidnapping. I know what it asks, Reed. She waited until he looked at her. He knows my mother's name, my employment history, details I never put on any document I gave to Vane's office. That means he has access to records from before I ever worked for him. She paused. That travel document isn't a peace offering. It's proof of how much he already controls. He wants me to understand that he can find anything he needs to find about me, anywhere. Reed looked at the bank draft. He's trying to frighten you into taking it, Reed said. He's succeeding at the frightening. That doesn't mean I take it. She picked up the bank draft and the travel pass and held them both out toward the lamp. But I'm keeping the identity document. It proves he has records on placement women that he claims don't exist. Reed was watching her. I need you to hear something, she said. I'm not staying because I have nowhere to go. I'm not staying because I owe you shelter repayment or because I'm afraid of what happens if I leave. If I walk out of here right now with this travel pass, I probably survive. I probably get east. I probably disappear. She set the pass down on the saddle rack. I'm staying because there are 12 women on a train, manifest with placement numbers instead of names, and I know how to read the code that moves them. There is no one else in a position to do what I can do with the information I have. She looked at him. That's why I'm staying. Reed was quiet for a moment. I want you to stay, he said. Then he stopped. She waited. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something, checking the depth. I want you to stay, he said again. And then he didn't finish it the way she half expected him to. He pulled back from the edge instead, and she saw him do it. Saw the deliberate restraint of it. She burned the travel pass over the lamp. She kept the identity document, folded it into the lining of her coat next to the ledger pages. Then she went to the supply room and pulled every feed record from the past month. She spent 2 hours cross-referencing Vane's supply codes, the ones she'd memorized from the placement ledger against the feed deliveries recorded in Lantern Rock's own books. Tobin sat beside her and read the numbers aloud while she tracked them on paper. It took 40 minutes to find it. A specific mineral compound used in Vane's freight operations as a solvent and listed under a supply code that any other reader would have mistaken for a routine cleaning agent. It had been added to a feed supplement delivery 3 days ago, signed for by a temporary hand who had since disappeared. She told Inez, who told Martinez, who went through every storage building on the property with a lantern and pulled 4 contaminated sacks from the back of the east storage room. The horses that had been sick began recovering by evening. Marin was in the courtyard, washing her hands at the pump, when Reed came to stand nearby. He had been to Cinder Wells and back in the late afternoon, and he'd returned with a different expression, something resolved in it, something that had been loose before and was now set. I signed a wage guarantee with my own land as surety, he said. My workers keep their pay regardless of the contract suspension. She turned off the pump. That's most of what you have. It's what they're owed. He leaned against the courtyard wall. Inez has already told me it was unnecessary, and also the correct decision. She's right on both counts. He almost smiled. She had noticed he did that sometimes came very close to something open in his expression, and then let it settle back into its usual steadiness, the way water levels after a stone. Deputy Beck came through the gate, just as the light went completely. He stopped inside the entrance and removed his hat. Reed, he said. He paused, which told her everything before the next sentence. The order says I take you at sunrise. Reed looked at him without surprise. Federal warrant, interference with freight operations, and harboring a fugitive. Beck held the hat in both hands. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, which at least told her he wasn't delivering this with pleasure. I fought it. I want you to know that. But it came from above my jurisdiction, and I can't hold my position against a direct federal order. Reed nodded once. All right, he said. Beck looked at Marin. You should know the warrant doesn't include you. Vane pulled the murder charge. For now, she said. Beck agreed. The courtyard was very quiet. Somewhere on the East Ridge, a coyote called and didn't get an answer. Marin went inside. She sat at the telegraph bench in the workshop. For a long time the lamp turned low, her hands in her lap. She could hear Reed and Beck talking in the courtyard, low voices. No urgency. She could hear Inez in the kitchen. The comfortable sounds of someone who maintains order by continuing to do necessary things. She thought about the train. 4 days had become one, and now one was becoming now, and she had 12 placement numbers in her memory, and a ledger in her coat, and a cipher strip in her boot, and no clear path forward. She put her hand on the telegraph key. She thought about what Reed had started to say in the barn and then hadn't. She sat there a long time. Reed was already dressed when Marin found him in the barn at first light, cinching the saddle on his good roan. You're going to surrender yourself, she said. Yes, that leaves the ranch without you during the most critical. Inez has authority over every decision on this property. She's had it for 12 years. He checked the cinch and straightened. Beck is an honest man. He'll keep me in Cinder Wells, not hand me to Vane's people. Once I'm in custody, Vane has no justification to send men onto the ranch. He doesn't need justification. He needs to avoid federal attention while he's moving that train. My arrest is already going to draw scrutiny. If something happens to this ranch and its workers on the same night, that's scrutiny he can't manage. He turned to face her. It keeps the hands safe. It keeps Inez and Tobin safe. She looked at him for a long moment. You gave Beck the Black Mesa ledger. Reed was quiet. I heard you last night, she said, in the courtyard. You told him you had documentation, and that he should keep it beyond your reach in case Vane's people searched the ranch. She kept her voice even. That ledger is my evidence. It corroborates my transcriptions. It was not yours to give without asking me. I didn't want it on the property. I understand what you wanted. She stepped closer. But you made a decision about evidence I gathered, at personal risk, without consulting me. That is exactly what Vane does. He decides how information moves and who gets to carry it. And the women in his placement system never get a vote. Reed absorbed that. You're right, he said. It wasn't defensive. It was plain. I know I'm right, she exhaled. I also understand why you did it. That's what makes it complicated. He leaned back against the stall. He looked at her with the full directness he usually kept at a slight angle, and she held it because looking away first had never been her instinct. I keep trying to protect people without telling them what I'm protecting them from, he said. My father used to say that a man who holds a door closed to keep the weather out is just a man holding a door closed. You can't always tell the difference from inside. No, she said. You can't. He was quiet for a moment. Asking you to stay here feels like claiming you, he said. And I won't do that. But I need to tell you honestly that losing you would matter. Beyond the evidence. Beyond the women on that train. He stopped. I haven't said that to anyone in a very long time, and I'm not certain I'm saying it correctly. You're saying it correctly. Then, I want you at Lantern Rock. After all of this is done. I want you to have reason to come back. He paused. I'm not asking you to decide that now. She stepped forward and closed the remaining distance between them. She kissed him, brief and deliberate, the way she did most things, not tentative, not dramatic, just honest. He kissed her back, the same way, one hand coming up to her jaw and then staying still there, careful of her choice. Then hoofbeats came through the gate. They separated. Both of them turned. 3 riders, and behind them Beck coming on foot from the direction of the road, his expression wrong, in a way she read immediately. Beck reached them ahead of the riders. My transport order was altered, he said. He was carrying a document, pointing at a section mid-page. The routing instruction. It sends Reed to a freight holding station outside of Vane's Copper Hollow Junction, not to the Territorial Marshal's office. This order didn't come from the Federal Circuit. He looked at Reed. Someone in Vane's office forged it. Reed read the page. If you'd followed it, Marin said, he'd have had you in his own facility. Yes. Beck took the order back, which means I have grounds to void the warrant pending verification of its source. But that takes time. We don't have time, Marin said. A figure appeared in the barn doorway behind the riders. June Halley. Her face was pale, and she was holding her arms across herself in a way that had nothing to do with cold. I need to tell you something, June said. Marin looked at her. Read the posture, the face, the particular quality of the silence around her. Who did you tell? Marin asked. June closed her eyes. He has Cora. He's had her for 3 months at a separate location. Not the main camp. Her voice was barely steady. He told me if I didn't report your location and your movements, he would. She stopped. I told him you were going to Black Mesa. I told him which route you planned. The cattle in the canyon. The brush fire at the relay station. Both of them. Marin felt the shape of it settle into place. The man in the barn, she said. The one we found hanging from the loft rope. Vane sent him to confirm my report, June said. When I realized they were going to hurt you, regardless of what I gave them, She looked at the floor. I didn't let him leave. Marin was quiet for a moment. Where is Cora now? She said. A freight warehouse outside of town. He's moving her tonight. Putting her on the train, June finally looked up. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I know it's not enough, Marin said plainly, but it's where we are. She looked at Reed. I need to get to that warehouse. June, Reed said, his voice carrying no particular judgment. Can you get us in? There's a loading entrance on the east side. I have a key. One of the riders, a vain man, Marin realized only now, too late had been listening from just outside the barn door. She heard the shift of his horse. She turned and saw him wheel toward the road. He'll report, Marin said. Reed was already moving for his horse. She grabbed his arm. If you ride after him, you're the man who assaulted Vane's rider the same night you evaded a federal warrant. She held his eyes. Let him go. Reed stopped. The rider disappeared down the road. Marin crossed to the fence post near the east gate. She crouched down and found the blue glass insulator she'd set there. 2 nights ago, when she had half-formed the idea and hadn't known yet if it would matter. She picked it up and pulled the small brass contact from her coat pocket, the one she'd been carrying since Seco Crossing. She pressed the contact against the base of the insulator and tapped a short sequence. 6 characters. The ranch code Tobin had taught her on the 2nd day. From the North Tower, 60 seconds later, the lantern moved, acknowledged. Tobin's on the tower, she said. He'll run the signal to every ranch and range that uses your father's network. When the time comes, they'll know. Reed looked at the tower, then at her. You planned that, he said. I planned for the possibility. She put the contact back in her pocket. There's a difference. Beck came to stand beside them. He had the forged warrant in his hand and an expression of a man who has made a decision and is now committed to it. I'm going to need to speak to that freight inspector. Personally, he said, which means I need to move tonight rather than wait for morning. He paused. I can't hold an arrest that was never legally issued. Then don't, Reed said. Beck looked between them. I'm telling you plainly that I cannot sanction whatever you're about to do. I know, Marin said. You've been very clear about that. Beck put his hat on. He turned toward the road. Then he stopped and said, without turning back, the freight warehouse east entrance typically isn't guarded before 9 in the evening. That's just a fact I happen to know. He kept walking. Marin looked at Reed. June was at the barn, door still quiet and pale. Can you ride tonight? Marin asked her. June straightened. Yes. Then you're going to help me get those women out. Marin held her eyes. Not because it forgives anything, because it's what you can do. June nodded once. No argument, no qualification. Marin went inside to collect the cipher strip and her coat. She paused in the workshop doorway and looked at the blue glass insulator on the shelf, the original, the one that had sat there through everything, catching whatever light came through the window and holding it. She picked it up and put it in her pocket. Then she went back out into the dark, inside the cinder wells, holding cell. Hours later, Reed sat on the wooden bench and listened to the town settle into midnight. He had surrendered at the marshal's office as planned, which at least had the virtue of being his own choice. Rather than Vane's, the cell was iron and adobe. The window was high and narrow. The water pipe ran along the base of the east wall. He heard it faintly at first, a sound too rhythmic to be the building settling, too deliberate to be the wind. He pressed his fingers to the pipe. Someone was tapping. He counted the pattern, then counted it again. He had only 3 days of practice with the code, but Marin had been patient and specific when she taught it, and she had told him to listen for the gaps as much as the signals, because the gaps were where the meaning lived. He counted it a 3rd time. 3 words: train, train, midnight, flood. He stood up and went to the cell door and called for the deputy on watch. He had something to say, and this time he was not going to sit back down. Marin came awake in the dark to the sound of iron wheels on iron rails. The freight car smelled of sawdust and old rope, and the particular staleness of a space that had carried livestock at some point and never been fully cleaned after. She was on the floor with her back against the wall. Her hands free, they hadn't bothered to bind her, which told her they were confident in the locks. She counted the other women in the dark by breathing. 11. plus herself made 12, which matched the manifest. Then a voice beside her. Very quiet. Marin. She turned her head. Cora Dyer was 23 years old and looked older, the way people do when they've spent time in a place that doesn't care about them. But her eyes were clear, and she was watching Marin with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting a long time for something to change. June told me about you, Cora said, before they separated us. She said if you were on this train, it meant things were moving. Things are moving, Marin said. June was somewhere in the forward section of the car. Marin had heard her voice briefly when they loaded, but the car was long and dark, and Vane's men had pushed people toward specific positions. Deliberate. Keeping anyone from organizing. Marin leaned back against the wall and pressed her palm flat against the floor. She felt the rail vibration through her hand, the locomotive's rhythm, the weight of the cars behind. The particular cadence of this specific engine. She had been listening to train vibrations since she was 17, and she knew them the way some people know voices. She counted the pulses. Divided by the wheel spacing, she could estimate from the car's construction. They were moving at moderate speed, not running flat out. Careful speed, which meant either a cautious engineer or a man who didn't want to arrive at Widow's Cut ahead of schedule. She felt along the floor seam until she found a loose bolt older car. The bolt had worked free from a floor bracket. She picked it up. She thought about Reed in the holding cell, fingers against a water pipe, counting 3 words. She thought about whether he had understood. She had to assume he had, because the alternative was to lie down in this freight car and wait for Widow's Cut, and she was not going to do that. She started tapping. Not on the floor, too much ambient noise from the wheels. She found the metal sidewall of the car near the base where it connected to the frame, and she tapped there. The vibration traveled through the car frame, into the coupling joints, along the truck assembly, and down to the rails. She kept the message short. Location, status, the emergency signal she and Tobin had agreed on when she'd taught him to combine the wire code with the tower patterns. She repeated it 3 times, evenly spaced. Somewhere ahead, if anyone was listening at a trackside maintenance box, they would hear it. She had to trust that Tobin was listening. The car lurched slightly, a change in grade. They were climbing. Marin stood and worked her way along the wall in the dark, moving toward the far end of the car. She counted women as she passed them, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet word, a deliberate inventory. She needed to know who could move and who couldn't. Most of them could move. They were exhausted and frightened, and several were sick from the water at Copper Hollow. But they were upright and functional. Years of placement work had a particular effect on people. It stripped away a certain kind of passivity and replaced it with a pragmatic watchfulness. These women had learned to pay attention because inattention cost them. At the far end of the car, June was crouched near the coupling door. The guard checks every 30 minutes, June said, very low. He came through 10 minutes ago. 20 minutes, Marin said. June reached into her boot and produced a key. Flat iron, old style, the kind used on freight car locks that hadn't been updated since the line was built. I took it off the guard when they put me in the car. He'll figure it out on the next check. Can you open that door? If the lock is the same type on this side as the outside, yes, do it. June worked in the dark by feel. Marin counted seconds. The lock gave on the 42nd second. Cold air came through the gap. The noise of the wheels came up immediately, much louder. The grade was steeper now, and the flood channel below the trestle was audible, even over the locomotive, a low, sustained roar that had been building all week with the storm runoff. Marin leaned out and looked back along the train. 8 cars. She and the women were in the 4th. Behind them, 3 freight cars in the caboose. Ahead, the tender, the locomotive. Somewhere in the forward freight cars, Vane's company records, the evidence he was bringing to Widow's Cut to destroy along with the witnesses. She thought about what Beck had said, that a federal inspector had made inquiries about the placement records. She thought about what that inspector would find if those records went into the flood channel tonight. She thought about the cipher strip in her boot heel. She looked at Cora. "I need you to do something difficult," Marin said. Cora looked at the open door and the dark rushing landscape beyond it and said, "Tell me what it is." Marin explained the coupling mechanism, how freight cars connected, where the pins were, what disconnecting the rear cars from the forward section would accomplish. She had worked a freight yard for 8 months at age 20, and the knowledge had simply stayed with her the way practical knowledge does. Cora listened without interrupting. "You'll need June to manage the pin," Marin said. "I need to get to the locomotive." "How?" "The same way you get anywhere on a moving train in the dark. Carefully." She looked at June. "When I reach the cab, I'll reduce the steam pressure. The engine will slow. That's your signal to disconnect the rear cars. The grade will carry them back away from the trestle. Reed's men need a clear track to divert the rear section onto the maintenance line. And if Reed's men aren't there?" June said. Marin paused for exactly 1 second. "Then we've slowed the train and separated the passenger cars from the locomotive. That's still better than the alternative." She pulled herself through the door. The roof of a moving freight car at night in a desert monsoon is a specific education. The wind came from the southwest and pushed hard, and the rain was just beginning again, a light spitting rain that made the car roof slick without providing any real grip. She moved on her hands and knees, 4-point contact at all times, the way Dentonfar had taught her to move across anything unstable. Always know where 3 of your 4 points are before you move. The 4th. She reached the forward coupling between her car and the next. She crossed it. The tender was 2 cars forward. She could see the firebox glow from here, orange light leaking around the cab's edges. She crossed the second coupling. The tender's rear ladder was 6 rungs of iron, bolted to the coal car's back end. She went up them fast and came over the top, and slid forward along the coal load, keeping low, until she reached the cab. The engineer was slumped against the forward console, drugged. His breathing was regular but deep, the specific depth of laudanum sleep. Still alive, that was something. She checked the pressure gauge. The boiler was running high. Someone had stoked it for speed and then removed the man responsible for moderating it. She located the steam regulator, then the brake wheel. She had operated a locomotive once for 11 minutes during an emergency at Seco Crossing, while the regular engineer was incapacitated. 11 minutes was not comprehensive training, but the principle was simple. Less steam, less speed. Less speed meant the brakes could hold. Hold long enough, and the train stopped. She began reducing the pressure. The locomotive started to slow. The cab door opened behind her. Darius Vane was not a large man. He was mid-50s, well-dressed even now, with a quality of stillness about him that she recognized from 3 years of working in his employ. The stillness of a man who has never had to hurry, because everything around him had always moved when he wanted it to. He held a small revolver with the practice of someone who had carried one most of his adult life. "Put your hands on the console," he said. She did. He came fully into the cab. He looked at the pressure gauge, at the sleeping engineer, at her face. He was measuring the situation with the same quality of attention she'd seen him apply to freight manifests. "You're more capable than I gave you credit for," he said. "Most women in your position would have taken the travel pass. Most women in my position don't have the cipher strip." He looked at her steadily. "Where is it?" "Somewhere you won't search in the next 5 minutes." Outside, the rain was picking up. She could hear the flood channel growing louder. They were close to Widow's Cut. She kept her hands on the console and kept him talking. "The placement ledger is already with a federal deputy," she said. "The routing orders, the debt calculations, the signal order from Black Mesa, all of it. Signed with your authorization. Documents can be contested. Not when the women who lived under those placement numbers are alive to confirm them." She watched his face. "You moved the schedule up because you thought speed would prevent exactly this, but you moved it up before you had everyone in position. You moved it up because you were afraid. Something shifted in his expression, very small. But she had spent 3 years learning to read the gaps. People without names are easy to move, he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of principle, the kind of thing a man says when he wants someone to understand how he sees the world, and easier to erase. You had no name when you came to me. Alice Trent had no name when she died. The women in this train have numbers. That's what you are, when no one is looking for you. He raised the revolver slightly. Give me the cipher strip, and I'll see that the train stops before the trestle. The train is already stopping, she said. He glanced at the pressure gauge. She moved. Not for the revolver. That was his ground, not hers. She went for the brake wheel, both hands, and threw it hard. The locomotive shrieked. Vane staggered. She kept hold of the wheel and looked back through the cab's rear window. She saw it. A light. Moving along the flood channel bank, at speed a rider. Single lantern. Coming from the north, toward the manual switch house. Coming through the water. Coming through a wash that was running knee-deep on a horse. She transmitted the only signal she could. She opened the firebox door and let the orange light pour out from the cab's side panel, then closed it, then opened it again. Short, long, short. The lantern rock emergency pattern. The rider below changed angle. Heading for the switch, she held the brake wheel and watched the dark and waited. Reed reached the switch house with water up to his horse's chest and a chain wrapped around the lever that he had not expected. He tied the horse to the switch frame and looked at the chain. It was freight-grade iron, newer than the switch itself, padlocked through 2 link points. Someone had placed it deliberately, recently, knowing exactly what to prevent. He didn't have a key. He had a horse. He pulled the saddle rigging, detached the pulling harness from behind the cantle, the one he used for moving heavy logs out of gullies. He had carried it for 20 years. Out of a habit his father had instilled in him. You never know what needs moving, and you cannot always predict when. He looped the harness around the chain and walked the horse out to the full length. Pull, he said. The horse understood pulling. It leaned into the harness, and the chain went taut, and the switch lever groaned, and the chain did not break, but the anchor bolt that held the chain bracket to the switch. Housing pulled slowly, with a sound like a tooth coming free. The lever moved halfway. Halfway was not enough. He repositioned the horse. Shorter line, different angle, the way his father had taught him to move a stuck fence post. Change the direction of force when the first direction fails. Change where the stress lands, not just how hard you push. The horse pulled again. The lever moved. It dropped into the secondary track position with a clank that he felt through his boots. He looked up at the trestle. The train's headlight was visible now, coming through the rain. Above it, the cab glowed orange and then dimmed, and then glowed again in a pattern he recognized because Marin had made him practice it for 20 minutes on his second day of learning the code. Short, long, short. He mounted and rode. The ranchers came in from the west, 6 of them, men who had been reading Elias Talbot's lantern signals since they were children and had responded when Tobin ran the towers. They came through the flood with ropes and tools and the simple certainty of people who had decided to be somewhere. Tobin was with them, on foot, already at the maintenance track junction. Beck arrived from the road with 2 federal riders, which meant he had found the freight inspector after all. Reed boarded the train from the tender ladder as the locomotive slowed, the same way Marin had. He went over the coal and into the cab and found her at the brake wheel, hands locked on it, and Vane on the floor of the cab with one hand pressed to his jaw and a revolver no longer in his possession. Marin looked at Reed. She looked at his shoulder, the one he'd injured at Black Mesa, which he had not mentioned and which was clearly visible in the way he was holding his arm. "The rear car," she said. "Switch is open. Tobin's guiding them onto the maintenance track. The engineer is drugged. I see him." He went to the brake wheel and added his weight to hers. The coupling? June and Cora. 2 minutes ago. He felt the change in the train's movement. As he said it, a slight release of tension, the forward section suddenly lighter, the rear cars falling away behind them onto the diverted track. Vane got to his feet. He did not reach for the revolver. He looked at Reed with the assessment of a man recalculating, and then he looked at the trestle ahead. And Marin watched him make a decision she didn't fully read until he moved toward the cab door. "He's going to jump," she said. Reed caught Vane's coat collar with his good hand. Vane wrenched sideways, and they went against the cab wall together, and then Beck was there. He had come up the tender, somehow, which was not behavior Marin associated with a federal deputy in his 40s, but here he was, and he put Vane's wrists together with a practiced efficiency that ended the question. The locomotive crossed the trestle at reduced speed. The trestle held. On the far side, the brake took full hold, and the train stopped on the level ground of the Widow's Cut approach. Marin stood in the locomotive cab in the rain and listened to the flood below the trestle moving fast and loud, and she felt the specific quality of the silence that exists after something almost happened. Then she climbed down. Cinder Wells in the middle of the night was more people than it typically held, because the lantern signals had gone out across the basin, and people had followed them the way people follow signals in the dark, not knowing exactly what they were riding toward, but knowing that Elias Talbot's towers didn't run for nothing. The depot was lit from inside. Alma Pike was at the telegraph bench. She had repaired the circuit herself. Marin could see the fresh splice in the line where Vane's men had cut it, wrapped now in electrical tape, with the careful workmanship of someone who had been a railroad operator before she was a postmistress. She had the key in her hand and the look of a woman who had made a decision and was finished second-guessing it. "The regional line is open," Alma said when Marin came through the door. "I have stations at Tucson, Benson, and Wilcox standing by." Marin sat down at the bench. She took the cipher strip from her boot heel. She laid it on the desk beside the shorthand pages she'd carried in her coat. She spread Vane's final written order, the one she'd taken from the cab, next to the Black Mesa ledger sheets. The gathered townspeople filled the doorway. Some were curious. Some were afraid. Some had been brought by the lantern signals from ranches 20 miles out and weren't entirely certain what they'd ridden in for. Marin addressed the room. She explained the cipher in plain language, how it worked, what it encoded, why no individual message made sense without the strip. She explained the placement routing system. She explained the debt structure, the freight codes, the signal order that had been used at Black Mesa 18 years before. She explained it all the way. She would explain a telegraph system to someone learning it for the first time, start with the principle, move to the mechanism, demonstrate with a specific example. She used Vane's own final order as the demonstration. She decoded it in real time, speaking each step aloud, and when she was done, the room understood what the order said and who had signed it and what it had been intended to accomplish on the Widow's Cut. Trestle. Then she put her hand on the key and transmitted it. All of it. The full order, the routing mark, the author's signature. Tucson first, then Benson, then Wilcox. She waited for each confirmation and read it aloud to the room when it came back. 3 stations answered. A 4th answer came from a different identifier, a federal freight inspector, who had apparently been monitoring the Tucson line since Beck's wire reached him 2 hours earlier. Vane, standing in the doorway with Beck's hand on his arm, watched his own message travel across his own telegraph network. He said nothing. June and Cora came into the depot with the other women from the rear cars, some of them still in traveling clothes, all of them looking at the room with the particular attention of people who have been controlled by information and are now watching it change direction. June spoke first. She named the Copper Hollow camp manager. She named 2 freight escorts by description and route number. She named the dates of arrivals and departures and the method by which the wage calculations were manipulated. She had memorized all of it over 2 years because survival in that environment required remembering what could not be written down. Cora confirmed everything. June said and added 3 names. June hadn't known. Beck was writing steadily. The freight inspector's return wire asked for the authorization signature to be retransmitted for his records. Marin sent it again. Reed came in from the door and stood at the edge of the room. He was soaked, and his shoulder was held wrong, and there was dried blood along his jawline from where he'd hit the cab wall. He looked at Marin at the telegraph bench, and she looked at him, and neither of them did anything particularly visible. But Alma Pike noticed it, and filed it away with the particular attentiveness of a woman who notices things. Reed reached into his coat and produced an old telegram Elias's copy, the warning that had never been forwarded to the inquiry. He walked to the front of the room. He stood in front of the gathered townspeople, some of whom had known his father, some of whom had believed what Vane's men said at the inquiry, most of whom had spent 18 years assuming the verdict was accurate. He read the telegram aloud. He read the date. He read the content. He explained what a suppressed warning message meant in the context of a freight inquiry. He said clearly that he had been present at the inquiry, that he had been asked to confirm his father's reports, and that he had not spoken. "I was afraid," he said, "and my silence let a false account stand for 18 years. I want that on record as well." The room was very quiet. Shorty, the hand who had been at Lantern Rock since Elias's time, said from the back, "It's on record now." He said it simply, without ceremony, the way you confirm a fact that no longer needs to be disputed. Vane moved. He had been still for 20 minutes, which was long enough that the collective attention of the room had shifted slightly away from him. He got one hand free of Beck's grip and came forward fast, pulling a small blade from inside his coat, a boot knife, short and practical. He was going for the cipher strip on the desk. Marin picked up the telegraph key by its base and turned. The brass base was heavy, built to stay on a desk during transmission. She brought it around in a compact arc and connected with his forearm. The knife went to the floor. Beck recovered Vane's wrist before he could find the knife. The room let out a collective breath. Beck looked at Marin, at the key in her hands. "Are you all right?" "Fine." She set the key back on the desk. "He's all yours." At the clerk's desk, Deputy Beck asked Marin what name should be entered in the official report. She looked at Reed. He was standing across the room, watching her with the same directness he'd shown her in the barn that morning, which felt like a week ago. She did not ask him to answer for her. She picked up the pen. "Marin Holt," she said, and signed it. Reed said quietly, from where he stood, "I knew your name before the paper did." The first autumn train reached Cinder Wells on a clear Tuesday morning in late September, running on a restored signal system that Alma Pike had supervised from the depot end while Marin managed the relay connections from Lantern Rock's workshop. The train was 20 minutes early. Alma sent a wire reporting this with a brevity that communicated considerable satisfaction. Darius Vane was in federal custody outside the territory, awaiting trial on charges that Beck had spent 6 weeks assembling with the precision of a man who intended them to hold. His freight and placement operations had been suspended. 3 camp managers had been arrested. 2 had provided testimony in exchange for consideration, which Beck accepted without enthusiasm and with careful documentation. The women from the manifest received wages recovered from Vane's operating accounts, real wages, calculated against what they should have been paid, rather than what the debt ledgers claimed. A federal auditor handled the calculation. Marin provided the cipher key. Cora Dyer chose to remain in Cinder Wells. She was studying with Inez, who had more medical knowledge than her title of ranch forewoman suggested, and who taught with the direct patience of someone who has never confused education with charity. Cora had a precise memory and steady hands, which Inez said were the 2 things she could work with. June was still earning her way back. She didn't ask for quick forgiveness, and the town didn't offer it quickly, which was probably the correct pace for both parties. She had taken in 2 of the other women from the manifest and was teaching them to sew on a commercial scale, which had the dual merit of being useful and being entirely June's own idea. Beck established a formal investigative process for placement company operations throughout the territory, which would not prevent all harm, but would make certain categories of harm considerably more difficult to conceal. He sent Marin a copy of the procedural framework with a brief note that said she was welcome to suggest corrections, as she knew the system better than he did. She corrected 4 procedural gaps and sent it back. Elias Talbot's warning messages were published in the territorial newspaper not as a dramatic expose, but as a formal correction of the inquiry record, which was the more durable form of justice. Reed read the piece once and did not display it on the wall or speak about it extensively. He folded it and put it, with the burned telegram, in a box in the workshop, which seemed to Marin like the right place for something that deserved to be kept, but did not need to be exhibited. The federal horse contract was restored in full, with a written acknowledgement from the remount inspector that the suspension had been issued on falsified grounds. Reed signed the renewal without visible satisfaction, because it was simply a return to where things should have been. Tobin had begun an apprenticeship in signal engineering with a firm out of Tucson, traveling back to the ranch on weekends to continue improving the flood warning towers. He had already designed a modification to the lantern housings that increased their range by a third. He explained it to Marin over dinner one evening, using a paper napkin and a spoon to illustrate the geometry, and she told him it was correct, which pleased him considerably. Alma Pike was named Regional Telegraph Supervisor. She kept the postmistress position as well, on the grounds that both jobs needed doing and she was capable of both. When the regional office questioned whether one person should hold 2 official roles, she sent a return wire of 14 words that resolved the question permanently. She never shared what those 14 words were. The Lantern Rock workshop had been reorganized. 3 of the spools of wire had been cleared from the south wall, and a second telegraph bench installed beside the original. A blackboard leaned against the east wall with a Morse reference chart written in Marin's clear instructor's hand. 4 women from Cinder Wells came to the first session. 2 of them, the seamstress who worked next to June's shop, and 1 the clerk's daughter, who had apparently been asking about telegraphy for 2 years and had been told consistently that it was not a common profession for women. Marin had not corrected this characterization in any formal way. She had simply set up the bench and opened the door and told Tobin to spread the word. The sessions ran twice a week. 1 room at the north end of the stone house had been cleared and furnished plainly but well. It had a working lock, a window to the outside, and a door key that stayed with whoever occupied the room. Inez managed the arrangements with a practicality that removed any quality of charity from the situation. Women who stayed worked in whatever capacity matched their skills, contributed to whatever needed doing, and left when they had somewhere to go or chose to stay if they found the ranch suited them. 2 women from the manifest had stayed on. 1 was working in the barn. 1 was learning the lantern code from Tobin, who turned out to be a patient teacher. The workshop had blue glass insulators on the windowsill, now 6 of them, salvaged from the old line when they restored the primary relay connection. In the late afternoon, when the sun came from the southwest at the angle it reached in early autumn, the light came through them and scattered across the workbench in pieces of blue and green that Tobin said looked like the inside of a wave. Marin had received the offer from Tucson in August. A permanent position managing a major telegraph office, real authority, real wages, a staff of 6, and a title that no one in the territory would have looked past. She had taken the stage to Tucson and spent 3 days inspecting the operation. It was everything it claimed to be. Clean, well-equipped, important work. The director was a competent man who had offered her the role without qualification or caveat, which she appreciated. She had declined the permanent position and proposed an alternative, a partnership arrangement, connecting the Tucson office to Lantern Rock's training program. As an official relay and certification station, women trained at Lantern Rock could be placed directly into the Tucson network upon completion. The ranch would function as a regional hub and receive a modest operating fee for each certified operator. The director had agreed after 2 days of consideration. She took the stage back to Cinder Wells. She did not send a wire ahead. Reed was at the south fence when she rode through the gate, checking the line he'd repaired after the storm damage. He heard the hoofbeats and turned and went very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that is different from his usual steadiness, because his usual steadiness was a choice, and this one was involuntary. He walked to meet her when she dismounted. He looked at her face, then at the bag on her saddle, then back at her face. "You came back," he said. "I came back with plans of my own this time." She pulled the partnership agreement from inside her coat. "The Tucson office is connected to Lantern Rock now. Officially, the training school has regional standing and its own operating income." He read the agreement. "You did this," he said. "This isn't shelter. This isn't needing somewhere to land." "No," she said. "It isn't." He folded the agreement and held it back out to her because it was hers to carry. "I want you to have an equal share in the signal station," he said, "and in the refuge, written in your own name, in your own right. I'll have it drawn up tomorrow. I'll review it before I sign it," she said. "I'd expect nothing less." He brought her to the ranch doorway, the same threshold she had crossed the first night, frightened and careful, with a travel case and a cipher strip and nowhere that was hers. He stopped there in the early evening light. "The first time I said, 'Come home,'" he said. "You came because you had nowhere else to go. I won't ask you to stay for that reason." He offered her the partnership agreement, her own name on the front page. "You have work of your own, money of your own, and a name no man gave you. So I'm asking now, will you come home because you choose me too?" She looked at the door, thought about standing in this same frame in the dark with one ankle wrapped and an oilcloth cipher strip in her boot, and a man she didn't know saying 2 words. She had been trying to interpret for weeks. "This stopped being only your home," she said, "when you gave me a key and never asked for it back." She walked inside. He followed. At dusk, they stood at the base of the first tower, while voices and the irregular clicking of student hands on practice keys came from the workshop behind them. Tobin was inside, correcting cadence with the particular patience of someone who has learned that timing is everything and cannot be rushed. 6 blue glass insulators caught the last of the light on the windowsill. Reed looked at the western sky, the color that comes just before stars. He reached up and pulled the lantern cord. The light moved out across the basin in a simple pattern, short, long, a signal that every ranch in range of Elias Talbot's towers had known since their parents were young. Across the dark, one by one, other towers answered. From the workshop window, the insulators caught the reflection and held it, each one a small version of the same light, passing the signal along. Home. There's a moment near the end of this story that I keep coming back to. Deputy Beck sits down at the clerk's desk, pen in hand, and asks Marin one simple question: what name should go in the official report? She looks across the room at Reed, and then she looks away from him. She picks up the pen herself. She writes Marin Holt, the name her mother gave her, the name no document had legally recognized in weeks, the name she had been running under the shadow of since the night the relay office burned. She doesn't ask Reed what to write. She doesn't wait for permission. She signs it herself. That moment is small. It takes maybe 4 seconds in the telling. But it carries the full weight of everything this story is actually about. We live in a world that has always had a version of Darius Vane in it. Not always with a freight company and a telegraph network. Sometimes it's a contract with fine print nobody explained. Sometimes it's a debt that keeps growing no matter how hard you work. Sometimes it's a system that reduces people to numbers on a manifest and moves them where it's most profitable, because people without names and people without connections are, as Vane puts it, easier to erase. The mechanism changes. The principle stays the same. And the first tool that system always reaches for is isolation. Cut the communication lines. Control what information moves and who gets to carry it. And you control the people. What Marin understands from the very first chapter is that knowledge is not neutral. It is the most dangerous thing she owns. She carries a cipher strip in her boot heel and shorthand pages sewn into her coat lining, not because she is sentimental about paper, but because she understands that the moment she loses the information, she loses the only leverage she has. She is a woman in 1887 Arizona with no legal identity and a murder warrant on her name, and the one thing that keeps her alive and free is that she knows something the most powerful man in the territory needs to take back from her. That's the first lesson this story teaches, and it teaches it through action rather than argument, knowledge, skill, and the willingness to use them. These are the things that cannot be taken from you as long as you understand their value. The second lesson lives in Reed Talbot. Reed is not a hero in the conventional sense. He doesn't ride in with a gun and solve the problem. What he does, and what makes him genuinely unusual in this kind of story, is that he offers Marin shelter without conditions, and then spends the entire story learning that even well-intentioned protection can become a form of control if you're not honest about what you're doing and why. When he gives Beck the Black Mesa ledger, without asking Marin first, she calls him on it directly. That is exactly what Vane does. He decides how information moves and who gets to carry it. And the women in his placement system never get a vote. Reed doesn't argue. He says you're right, and he means it. A man who can hear that and say you're right without making it about his own feelings is rarer than fiction usually admits. Reed's emotional transformation is not dramatic. It's not a single speech or a single heroic act. It's a series of small choices, giving Marin a key and never asking for it back, letting her burn the travel pass without trying to talk her out of it, following her hand signals on a moving locomotive instead of assuming he knows better. That accumulation of small choices is what trust actually looks like. Not a declaration, a pattern. Thank you for spending this time with Marin and Reed and the people of Lantern Rock. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment telling me which moment stayed with you longest. And if you want more stories like this, one stories about people who earn their place in the world on their own terms, subscribe and come back. There are more of them waiting. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, organizations, and locations are entirely invented, and any resemblance to real persons or historical entities is coincidental. This narrative is created for entertainment purposes only and does not represent historical fact.